There are a number of corrections that I need to make to this ship. It will not be apparent to you since I make videos in advance, but I've been on a break for about a month, so from my end there hasn't been much progress on the ship. And when I got back from this break, I looked over the guide that Pen 51 produced on the HMS Hood Association's website, and I saw that there are a number of new suggestions in that guide, so I thought I'd take a moment to incorporate those into the model before I continued building the forward superstructure. The first is to open up this section of the rear screen. As molded, this area of the ship is symmetrical on the port and starboard side. That is in fact incorrect. Port side needs to have this opening widened just a little bit, so I need to cut that out. This would have been a lot easier to do before installing this on the ship, but with a very fine saw like this, it's actually quite easy to cut it out. Step one is to use this fine saw to cut back to the line where it needs to be broken off. Once I've sawed in far enough on both the upper and lower sections of this opening, and then use a knife to create a line to indicate the edge of this opening. And then in the corners I use a small drill bit to create a hole that will be just big enough for me to get a hobby knife into, so that I can start cutting out this section. I then use a hobby knife to open up that hole just a little bit more so that I can get in a different type of saw with a sharp edge so that I can start cutting along the vertical line to remove this section of plastic. I am being careful not to damage the details on the inside of the ship, and this is a very constrained place, but although a little bit tricky, it's not difficult, and I'm able to get it out quite easily and have a good straight edge on all three sides. I do see a bit of burring on the edges after I remove this section of plastic, but that is easily resolved using a file. Since this has been cut out very cleanly, it doesn't actually require any further touch-up. All that I'll do is repaint the cut surface at a later point. The next detail that needs to be corrected are these vents. In 1941, these vents were closed with a metal plate. To simulate the plate, I use plastic putty to fill in the gap between the vents and close it off. In hindsight, it probably would have been easier just to rip off this photo etch with tweezers and then cut out a piece of styrene stock in a square and then just cover the hole. But at the time, I didn't think of that. I just reached for my plastic putty and filled the hole. It did work out quite well, but it probably required a bit more sanding and filling than would have been required if I had just used a piece of styrene stock. In this hodgepodge video of things to be done, I also realized that it was now necessary to install the base of the Admiral's Bridge to the top of this lower section of the forward superstructure. This is just because there is a gap at the top of these signal shelters that I'm applying glue to that will need to be blended into the bottom of the Admiral's Bridge. To glue it down, I apply Revell Contactor Professional using a brush to the top of the structure and then place the Admiral's Bridge onto the signalman's shelters. After giving the glue a short amount of time to dry, I then fill the gaps between the top of the signalman's shelter and the bottom of the Admiral's deck with plastic putty. On this side, the splinter shield on the Admiral's deck sits back a bit far from the top of the signalman's shelter, so I bulk up the splinter shield with a little bit of plastic putty. On the port side of the ship, the issue is less pronounced, and I'm able to align the top of the signalman's shelters with the bottom of the Admiral's deck quite easily. After giving the putty some time to dry, I can now return to the sanding phase. Before sanding the putty plates on the rear screens, I mask off the area to protect the paintwork in the surrounding area, and then sand off the top using a 400 grit sandpaper. I repeat the process on the starboard side of the ship. After sanding, I remask the area and spray the top of the panels with Mr. Surfacer 500. I give similar treatment to the top of the signalman's shelters / bottom of the Admiral's deck, and then spray the area once again with Mr. Surfacer 500. After giving the surfacer a short amount of time to dry, I then spray over it using Tamiya XF53, the color that I'm using to represent Hood's superstructure color. While I have the XF53 loaded, I also need to paint the cover plates over the vents on the rear screen. In this case, I just need to mask off the deck and the decal above this line through the screen. Obviously, if I paint on that, I won't be able to easily correct it. So a little bit of masking tape protects that, and then I'm able to spray the area with more XF53 to blend the plate into the rear screen. I then repeat the process on the starboard side of the ship. Although I did cut out this opening in the screen very cleanly, the one thing that I couldn't do was preserve the paint on the edge that I cut out. Well, I can't really say preserve because the paint wasn't there ever anyway. Regardless, there is an edge that isn't painted, so I can just quickly mask off that area and then paint it as well with XF53. While spraying XF53, I did manage to overspray some of it onto the signal deck, which is a bit irritating, so I have to mask that off and respray that in deck linoleum, which is the color that I'm using for quartzine. That was about an hour of work, which shouldn't have been necessary. After fixing this overspray, there are also a few other corrections that I want to make to the deck color. The deck under these forward 1/2-inch machine guns, I'm going to change from Semtex to quartzine, so paint them in this deck linoleum color as well. And then also the deck for the Admiral's Bridge itself. I'm going to change its color from Semtex to quartzine. There's a lot of uncertainty about the color of this deck. The resources that I've seen say that it was either Semtex or quartzine, but the exact color is unknown. To me, that is a bit of a license to make my own choice. So I've decided to change its color to quartzine just so that it has a better contrast with the color for the superstructure. Just makes things a little bit more interesting. That's the only real reason why I'm doing this. If somebody finds a compelling reason for it to remain Semtex, then I will happily change the color back to what it is now. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't any real proof either way, so I feel as though I get to make this choice. The last correction that I'm going to make in this video is to install yet another support pillar between the shelter deck and the forecastle deck in this enclosed deck area. You see it in a lot of images that there is a thin support with a triangular top in the corner of this, 4-inch gun placement. For the support pillar itself, I use a 0.5 by 0.25 millimeter of styrene stock that I cut to length on the model, which is then glued in place using Revell Contactor Professional and Trumpeter extra thin plastic cement. For the triangular upper section of the support, I use 1 by 1.5 millimeter styrene stock, which I then cut at a 60-degree angle using the chopper. The triangular sections are then glued in place using Revell Contactor Professional, and then I reinforce that bond with Trumpeter extra thin plastic cement. Once the glue has dried, I then brush paint them in XF53 to bring their color in line with the rest of the model. That is where I'm going to end these corrections. In the next video, I will do something that I've been threatening to do for a very long time now, and actually glue the base of the forward superstructure onto the hull. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.